And let me share my PowerPoint with you all. All right, so we're going over Chicano studies terminology, and I'll give you your I'll give you a reading for the next week as well. Um, it's that should already be. I don't know if it's not posted. I'll make it live after we get out of class. All right, Chicana and Chicano studies, sometimes known as Chicanx or Latinx, depending on what school you attend. We haven't quite adopted the X part in Chicanx or Latinx, so our department is called Chicana and Chicano studies. It used to not be known as A/O, it was only O, right? And for example, the Chicano movement, right? I'm sure you heard of that since the 1960s. So, what's the difference between A and O and O only? Anybody know? You can write it in the chat if you like.
Masculine versus feminine.
That's true. There's also that's very true. Gender as well as Nancy said. There's also another, for example, meaning to it. People who speak Spanish will usually argue this. Um, so right, Natasha, A for feminine and O for male. For example, let's see. A dog, for example, dog is perro, male dog. See, in English, we just say dog. We don't really differentiate, or horse, right? But in Spanish, they have different names for different things. I would say it's a more complete language. I'm sorry to talk bad about English, but Spanish and French and German, they're all way more complete than English. I think that's why it's so hard for a lot of people to learn English in this country. There's all these like weird rules that sometimes apply and sometimes do not apply. So when you wonder why your grandma has been here for 40 years and she doesn't speak a word of English, that's because English sucks. I'm sorry to say, compared to the other languages. They're so clear, they're so easy to understand. You could write a paragraph or an essay in Spanish and have all the rules there and follow the rules, but in English, sometimes like the rules don't matter. And then like there's different ways to spell different things. Like bread is BRED, as in my birds, my dog bread, right? With another dog. Or bread is also BREAD, which is like I'd like to eat bread, right? Or like read is READ, but it's also REED, right? Uh, or read a book is spelled the same way as read a book. You know, so hard for Mexicanos to learn English. Anyway, so where was I at? I don't even remember what we were talking about. See what I'm talking about? We just go off track. Oh, Chicana and Chicano, right? So if you speak Spanish, you know that perro is male and perra is a female dog, right? But also, for example, Chicano, for example, also means male and female, right? It means like Chicano people, right? So Chicano means male and female. So a lot of people who speak Spanish will argue we don't need the Chicana and Chicano. We could just say Chicano because even though it ends with O, a masculine ending, it doesn't really mean anything masculine. It encompasses both male and female, right? But recently people have argued that, oh, well, we should give space to females by doing A/O. So the A/O really started happening in the late 60s and early 70s. And we'll talk about that later in class, not today. Just so you get an idea of when these things started happening. Chicano, like Chicano people, when you're speaking in English, Chicano doesn't only mean like male, because in Spanish, Chicanos means everybody. Chicanos can mean two things, right? It means people who are of Chicano background, whether they're male or female. But Chicanos can also mean male people who associate themselves as Chicanos, right? So that's why they added the A/O. Hey, Chicanos means male, so let's add Chicana and Chicano. And other people were like, Chicanos means everybody, right? So there's always that fight that happens, right? And also the new one that's been going around for a couple of years. Chican X or Latinx. Anybody know why they have that or what that means? No answers to that,
Gender neutrality.
right? So Chicano, Chicana, and Chicano actually, in my opinion, is probably less complete than just Chicano because Chicano includes all people. Chicana and Chicano means Chicanas, who are female, and Chicanos, who are male. What if somebody doesn't abide by either male or female, or they're non-gender conforming or whatever? Then does that mean they don't fit? So that's why they started adding an X. It's, to put it very like simply, maybe this is a very dumb way of explaining it, but including non-gender as well. Yes, thank you, Natasha. To put it very like simply, it's like when you're taking math class. The first day I jumped into algebra, I thought X was like the number 22 or whatever, or 23, because I thought that was the 22nd or third letter in the alphabet. I don't know. And the teacher said, so the teacher asked, "What's X?" And I was like, "X equals 23, right? A, B, C, D, E, or whatever." And they said, "No, X can mean anything, right?" So that's kind of how you can think about it. X can mean anything, right? Transgender, it can mean male, it can mean non-gender conforming, it can mean female, it can mean anything, right? So that's why people started using that. And there's still a lot of backlash with that, which I'll let you go look up on your own if you want. So originally known as Chicana, sorry, Chicano, and now it's known as Chicana and Chicano. This is the systematic study of Latinx people or Latinos, specifically those of Mexican descent, people that come from Mexico, first, second, third generation or whatever. And this study here in the United States is known as Chicana and Chicano studies. Anybody know who this person is pictured there? Their name is Ruben Salazar. Anybody know what's important about him or why I have him in picture here? I think this is a stamp, right? So that means it's sort of pop culture-ish if the USPS is willing to put that dude on a stamp. Anybody know? Ruben Salazar. He was, I think he would be very relevant today. He was a writer for the LA Times and other newspaper outlets and other media, and he wrote against police brutality, specifically LAPD against blacks, against minorities in general, especially Chicano people. Um, and during one of the peaceful protests, I think it was 1970, the Chicano moratorium, as they call it. We'll learn about that later. He was killed by the LAPD. They said it was an accident. They didn't even know he was in the building, but they fired a tear gas canister. And story is it took his head off, whatever that means. I don't know if like literally or that just means he died. So people were like, he wrote against police brutality, but the LAPD ended up killing him. Maybe it was on purpose, but back then we didn't have cameras. We don't have anything. We don't know anything, right? So let's see. So let's go over some of these important terms. I'm gonna skip over some of them because I think you can just read them on your own. This is redundant for me to read out loud for you. But some of them that needed further explanation, we're going over cultural assimilation. Very important, the process by which an individual or group acquires the culture traits of a different ethnic or cultural group, right? And we're all assimilated culturally. You all know what assimilation means. And no, you don't have to write this down because it's in the PowerPoint that I'll post. And also made some lecture notes with it on it in case you don't want to open the PowerPoint and only want to see the actual text. Assimilation is sometimes voluntary um, acquiring of behavior traits or patterns or lifestyle of the dominant group. If two groups assimilate and their differences begin to decrease over time, that's kind of known as raza cósmica, but we're not really going to get into that today. Um, Pluralism and bicultural. Pluralism exists when groups maintain their individual identities. In a pluralistic society, groups remain separate and their cultures and social differences persist over time. Some people could argue that that's racism, and that's a practice of racism. For example, ethnic studies in the states of like Arizona was banned a couple years ago because the people who made the laws to ban ethnic studies were saying that why are you teaching African American history? Why don't you teach regular history? You're sort of like alienating white people by only teaching African American history. That's racist that you're only teaching African American history. That's like if you only dated black women, then that means you're racist against everybody else, which is not the case at all. The reason ethnic studies exist, or Chicano studies, including Asian American studies or African American studies, whatever, women studies, the only reason that all these exist is because the history of African Americans, of Asian Americans, of Chicanos, for example, has not been included in the history books. The history books that I used when I was in high school, I went to high school way before you all, in the late 90s. I graduated in the year 2000. We had no Chicano studies. I think my senior year, they finally made a Chicano studies class. But I didn't take it because I was like, Chicano? What is that? I'm Mexican. I don't need that. I know what banda is. What the heck do I need Chicano studies for, right? So I figured I didn't need any of that stuff. And I was wrong. I should have taken it. I didn't know that I needed it. Now it's a requirement, or it's going to be a requirement here in California. But the reason they have that is because when I took my American history courses, my US history courses, they never included anything about Chicano people, about minorities at all. I teach a class where we talk about Japanese internment camps, and I was surprised that so many students already knew what that was. I never learned about that in high school. They didn't teach any of that stuff. They're like World War II, we were the good guys, the Germans were the bad guys. We beat up and we killed the Nazis and we won. Yeah, that's all they teach you. They don't teach you how this country was built on the backs of Japanese Americans, of African Americans, and Mexican Americans, etc., Filipinos, all of them. Right? They don't teach you any of that. That's why ethnic studies exist, because you basically skipped over the history of minorities. Right? Bicultural, to acquire culture traits of mainstream American culture, and also retain your own ethnic characteristics. We are all, I hope, multicultural or bicultural in this house. Sorry, in this house, in my house, in this classroom, right? We are all that. For example, in the mornings I eat my, I don't know, tortillas with frijoles, and then I'm speaking Spanish to my kids, and then at lunchtime I'm out teaching class. I mean, not now because we're still in quarantine, right? But and I eat a hamburger, right? For example, so you just ate American food, but then Mexican food, you were speaking English and then Spanish, or vice versa. So we are all bicultural. I've seen like bicultural to the max. There's some, like, I went to this Mexican Asian place in El Monte before that stuff was cool. Like back in the day when it wasn't cool, it was like a Mexican restaurant owned by like Chinese people. So I got like I ordered a burrito, and they came with like white rice and teriyaki chicken burrito, white rice and like teriyaki chicken. And I took a bite and I was like, this, what? That's not a burrito, right? Now it's like cool. You have like, now that's a cool thing. Back in the day, that was whack. That was like Chinese people trying to make Mexican food, or Mexican people trying to make Chinese food. It doesn't work, right? Back then. Now it's very cool. Now you got Mexicanos making sushi, and it's not real sushi. A Japanese would be like, that's fake, but it's still good, right? It's still good, and those restaurants are full. And now you got like Japanese people making tacos. Mexicanos are like, that's not real tacos, but it's still good, and those places are popping because they're like multicultural. We know our history. Anyway, racism. Let's skip over some of these. Racism is the belief that humans can be validly grouped on the basis of their biological traits. In other words, if I'm white, I'm better than anybody that's not white. I'm smarter than anybody that's not white. That's where like entitlement comes from. I don't know if you've been seeing like the news in the past year, especially since like the Black Lives Matter movement took hold after the George Floyd death or murder. And you see a lot of people coming out even before then, who you watch them on YouTube or TV or Facebook or TikTok or wherever you watch news, and you just see like the entitlement of a lot of people. Like they think they can walk into this place and tell people and point to people and tell them how it is because of the color of their skin, right? Like I would never dare to do that, but a lot of people feel like they're entitled based on their lineage or their heritage or what the color of their skin is. Racism, like it says down here, is not just a set of beliefs, but it is also a practice. Like I do not blame Donald Trump for if you think he's racist, maybe you don't. Yeah, Delilah said Karens, right? Oscar said it's Sushi Loco. Yeah, I know exactly what you guys are talking about. Sushi Loco. I've never been there, but I can imagine. Um, what they're talking about? Donald Trump, our ex-president. A lot of people think that he's racist. I don't blame Donald Trump at all. He didn't wake up one day and said, I'm just gonna say bad things about Mexicans or about this or about that. Um, where did he learn? My point is, and somebody said Donald Trump's followers are racist. Also, like, uh, you can't even blame those people either. Where do they learn it from? They learned it from somebody. That's who you're supposed to blame. Imagine my kid and I teach him his whole life. Like, imagine I have a black neighbor, a black neighbor and a brown neighbor on one side of me, and I teach him exactly, Oscar, you're a product of your environment. I teach him that the Mexican neighbor is trash, and so is the African American neighbor, and that they're mean and don't talk to them, and those people are dirty and this and that, and they'll probably steal your watch or whatever.
Oh, I have a question.
Go ahead.
Would it be racist for someone to say to a white person, "Oh, well, you own slaves, so you don't have an opinion," but it turns out they're Irish and they weren't here during colonialism?
Well, I mean that's actually not like a true statement, because that person is probably only 30 years old and they did not own slaves. But I get what you're saying. But your argument could be put in a better way. In other words, if you don't, so I'll get back to this. I'll get to your question in a second. Let me finish my thought, otherwise I'll forget. So my son, he grows up learning that. Is it his fault that when he's 21 years old, he's racist against black and brown people? It's not his fault. I mean, should he be smart enough to change that? Yes. But when he sees his dad as racist and his mom and maybe his grandma, and that for him, it's just normal. That's why somebody said the Trump followers, yeah, but where they live in this bubble where everybody around them is like that as well. Right. So to them, that's a natural thing. That's why it's very hard if you're like, it's ignorance, I guess. But see, even then to them, they don't even know that they're ignorant. You could argue all day with a Trump follower on Facebook, and at the end of the day, you're never going to get through to them because they think you're coming out of left field, right? So it doesn't, like, I've gotten in one or two arguments since, in the last year, and I don't get in very many of them because you cannot convince anybody otherwise with facts, with articles, with books. I could have a PhD in African American studies and talk to somebody about how African American people have suffered racism, and this guy who like didn't graduate high school seems that to think that he has the answers, uh, and think that he has more answers than I do, and will not believe anything I say, who got a PhD, who went to school, who studied this for 20 years, right? You get what I'm saying? Like, you cannot argue with them because they live in this bubble that you call ignorance, but to them, they don't even feel like they're ignorant. They think that they're absolutely right because everybody around them believes the same exact thing, and they've been fed that since their childhood, right? But racism, as I was saying, is not just a belief, right? It's what you do with those beliefs. Like somebody mentioned Karens a little while ago. Like the fact that you think you can, like, that you're entitled and you can tell people what to do and where to go and talk about their skin color and where to go back to their country or whatever. That's that actually makes you racist, right? Let's see some of these comments. Some people pick it up because of who they befriend. That's very true. Definitely, it comes down to being a product of your environment. I think things are gonna change for the better. Martin Luther King, we just celebrated his birthday, right? Was talking about police brutality in the 60s. So was Malcolm X. So was Ruben Salazar. And it seems like in the year 2020, we're still talking about police brutality. Like, how can that happen 50 years later, 60 years later? We're talking about the same exact thing. And it comes down to what Natasha said, it's ignorance. But how do we get ignorant? by not learning when we're young kids. So the fact, here's one really good thing that I think is going to make a, our country and put it in a better spot in the future, maybe our kids. The fact that they are requiring ethnic studies to be taught in K through 12, I think, kind of like, if your parents are telling you, bad things about black people, but then you're learning the truth in class, you might break out of that mold. So instead of you, living in this bubble of racism, like, you're going to be the one that breaks out, right? So I think ethnic studies in K through 12 will help you, because all my friends, and I have a lot of them who are like Trump supporters, I get I get why they're Trump supporters, because they didn't get any of that in high school. By the time like the issue comes and drops in their face, they don't understand like the history of racism and systemic racism and all that, because they never learned about it. It's already too late for them. They have their entire lives thinking that, like, yeah, if you work hard, you can make it, and that's all that it takes. There's hard work. Doesn't matter if you're black or white or brown. Doesn't matter, right? But if you teach people right off the bat that, hey, the system has been rigged for some people and it hasn't for others, then you start like opening your eyes at a very young age. But people who didn't have that, are now racist or Karens or whatever. So I think ethnic studies and its implementation is actually a good thing. So back to, who was it? Was that you, Omar, that asked the question? So I think you can word it in other ways. For example, people who are saying that police brutality isn't a thing, or that black people exaggerate, or that, why did the black guy run in the first place? He should have just stood there with his hands up, and are white. Your argument shouldn't be like, well, you own slaves, so you can't talk. Your argument should be like, well, you're not black, so you can't talk. Like all these white NFL fans saying, hey, I think, or MLB fans, I think Cleveland Indians is a bad name. Is a good name. Quit being offended, by the Chief Wahoo. If you notice that, the chief on the Cleveland Indians hat, they banned that a couple, I think, years ago, and they're finally like going through with it. In my opinion, again, same thing that you could argue. If you are white, you have no opinion about how Native Americans feel. Like, don't say anything. Don't say anything. If you agree with them, then go ahead and say it, right? But if you don't agree with them, then you should be smart enough not to say anything. That's like, if a woman gets sexually abused, and I'm over here like, yeah, I know how that feels, man. Like, no, I don't. Like, I have no idea. The only thing you can do is be there, not judge him. You can't do anything but that. You cannot do that as a man. I've seen, like, there's a lot of examples, but also the fact that you brought things up about Irish people and slaves. That's a different issue, which we're not going to get into this class. But Irish people and slaves were at the same level, right? They were both considered like the lowest of the lowest. And then you had Bacon's Rebellion. I don't know what year what that was, but that was like the first rebellion that involved, right, indentured servants, blacks and whites. And by whites, I mean Irish, right? And that's, I think, when racism really started in America, because the white people that were up here were like, you know what? Like, yeah, people are mad at us because we're subordinating them, but half the people that are mad at us are our skin color. So we got to do something about that. We got to convince the whites, Irish, that they're actually better than the people they're fighting alongside with. And they ended up doing that, right? So you can't say like, oh, except the Irish, because yeah, maybe they came later, but they were still convinced sooner or later that they were better than black people, because that was one of the only like integrated rebellions in our history, Bacon's Rebellion. Because other than that, it's just black people versus white people. In that occasion, it was black and Irish. But then the white people in this country figured out that, hey, we need to start like differentiating by color, not by where you come from or class, because that Irish person looks exactly like me from England, right? So then, if we really want to like set ourselves apart from black people and Native Americans, then we got to put all white people in one top big category, right? But your arguments there, you just need to like, I mean, I wouldn't tell anybody you can't say nothing because you own slaves. I mean, but you could say like you can't say anything because you're white. Like there's no don't just don't, right? So yeah, I get what you're saying though. That's a good point.
Oh, I wasn't bringing it up like that. I'm gonna use that.
No, I understand. I'm just it was a
Like,
question. I get
say-
that. Yeah, I get that. Let's see. Ethnocentrism. Here's another tricky term. Most ethnic groups within society tend to think that their culture is superior than the cultures of other groups. That's true. This can sometimes lead to separatism, which is do I have it here? Oh, but I think you know what separatism means. It's not always a bad thing, though. It depends. What? Let me see. They got scared. Irish and blacks were teaming up. Yeah, that's right. So they had to like, white people come back on our side, right? So yeah, they did that. Separatism can be a bad thing. It is a bad thing. Ethnocentrism doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, right? I am Mexicano. I think Mexicanos are the best, bar none. I think the most beautiful people in the world. I also think they're the nicest people in the world. I also think they're the best cooks in the world. Like what else? What else matters in life? Food and beauty. That's about it, right? You know, nothing else. Mexicanos are the top. But if you're like Japanese American, you're probably like, like Japanese are the like I'm in love with Japanese people. Japanese food is the best. Japanese people are the nicest, you know? Like, but once you start acting on those things, then it becomes racist. And by acting, I don't mean like I'm gonna marry a Japanese person. No, I don't mean that. I mean, but like I'm gonna make laws that impact other people in a negative way, but don't impact Japanese people in a negative way. That's when it becomes racism. But ethnocentrism isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? That's just almost like in a way like pride in your culture while respecting other cultures that exist, right? So some people, this is kind of like this bubble that we're talking about. Some people like in cultural encapsulation, when an individual grows up surrounded by their own ethnic or cultural enclaves, that can be a bad thing as well, because then they're not exposed to other things, right? It's crazy. In the town that I live in, there's like no black people. It's been known as like a KKK town, and so I always wonder like, why are black people like, how come they never show up here, you know? And I think people know that you drive around there, there's a lot of like non-black people. And so growing up, like I didn't, it was all Mexicanos and white people, but still Mexicanos mostly, and a few white people. And I get to college, and I'll give you an example of like how this confused me. I sat next to this person. I was like trying to like make small talk. This is my first day of orientation. I'm like, hey, how are you? Where are you from? Like, you're Mexicana? She looked Mexicana to me. And she's like, no, I'm Egyptian. And she was all offended that I call her Mexican. And I was like, oh, wow, sorry. And then, like, 2 days later, this Japanese woman next to me, I also thought she was Mexicana, because to me, everybody's Mexican, because I grew up in this like bubble of Mexicanos. Whereas if you grow up in LA or Orange County or some of these bigger cities, you like learn not to assume that that person is Mexicana, because they could be Puerto Rican. They could, you know, I've never seen a Puerto Rican growing up or a black person. You know, it was like very much like cultural encapsulation, right? And it kind of shocked me. I had like what they call culture shock in college, because I was only surrounded by Mexicans my entire life. Let's see. Let's go on to the 8 differentiating factors, and we'll see how many we can get through without going too much. This is also on your notes for the class. The territory. So there's 8 factors that this guy by the name of Alfredo Mirande, I believe in 1985 maybe, wrote down. Some of them I don't agree with, but he wrote down 8 things that supposedly make up Chicanos and culture and stuff like they're like 8 definitions of what makes up a Chicano. So the first one, and it's people. The first one is the territory and the community are the result of a war, one in specific, its legacy socially and institutionally. Okay, anybody want to guess which war we're talking about? Which war? Usually people guess wrong. Maybe we can guess right. Which war are we talking about? We just celebrated, like, not, we didn't celebrate, but the day of the ending of the war just happened this week, like Tuesday or something. Richie Valens died yesterday in 59. That was February 3rd. But what happened February 2nd? The end of the Mexican American War. The Mexican American War is the one we're talking about. All this land that we're on now used to be owned by Mexico, right? Richie, yeah, that's right, Nancy. That his death was his anniversary. You know, when the plane goes down, right? Him, not just him, but Buddy Holly and the Big Bopper. We can't forget those either. But Mexicanos could care less about those guys. We lost our Richie, right? That's all they care about. So, 19, 1848 is the end of the war. All this land used to belong to Mexico. I don't know if we get to that in this class. Yeah, we do get to that in this class. And but our territory, our community, are a result of that war. So it's a 2-year war, 1846 to 1848. We'll get into it later on in the semester, maybe in a couple of weeks. Number 2, the Chicana community is set off racially from other sectors of society. That's kind of an obvious point, right? We are minorities. What's the problem with this word minority? Anybody know? You want to guess? What's the problem with the word minority? Why is that a problem? Think about the word. What does it mean? But what does it actually mean? Minority. It means less. So in California, Mexicanos, thank you, Delilah. Mexicanos are black people, are minorities, just like they are in the United States. But in Los Angeles, for example, less than, right? If 51 out of 100 people are white and 49 of them are Mexican, then Mexicanos are the minorities. But in Los Angeles, for example, are Mexicanos technically the minority? They are not, right? So then, therefore, minority sort of becomes a bad word. Like, not that it's bad, but minority means non-white. It means the other. That's why it's bad. Minority should just be number, right? There's less brown people and there's less black people. So therefore, they're minorities. But in 2021, there's more black and brown people than there is white people. But they're still called the minorities. Think about that. Maybe because their voice and their opinions and their vote and everything actually matters less, right? Some people assume that as well. That's why they have like gerrymandering, which we're not going to get into right now, and all that. You break apart brown communities, and then they can't vote together, you know, for the betterment of that community. They're broken apart, so they have to vote separate, stuff like that. So it's kind of like a bad word because Mexicanos aren't the minority; we're the majority. So then why are we still being called minorities? All right, the practice of racism and its impact peculiar to the people of Mexico. That's all that says. Number 3 is that there's racism against Mexicanos. That's a very obvious one. Number 4, let's see if we can guess this one. An area perceived as homeland which has had a continuing numerous population. Anybody know what area we're talking about? What homeland? What are we talking about in number 4? Here's one word. I'll write it in the chat. Aztlan. Like, does that exist or not? First of all, that's the mythical homeland of the Aztecs, which are one of the most powerful empires indigenous in the history of Mexico, right? So if we somewhere down our lineage are indigenous, and we are, if you come from Mexico or Guatemala or Central America, you all have some like indigenous in you. We all do. Doesn't matter how white you are, you have some indigenous in you. Maybe you have less indigenous, but we all have indigenous in our blood. And if they actually came from the United States, because they said Aztlan is somewhere like that's their actual homeland where they came from, not Mexico. They migrated from the US to Mexico in like 1100. It took them a couple hundred years. And they saw the eagle sitting on a cactus, and bam, that's where you get Mexico City. And we think Aztecs are from Mexico City, but in reality, before that, they also had history in the United States. So our homeland isn't actually Mexico, it's here in the United States. So that's a way to that's why teaching like indigenous Mexican like culture is a way of like harnessing everybody together, corralling them all together, because you kind of put everybody on the same boat. Like, hey, I'm from Sinaloa, you're from Chihuahua, we're like different, or you're from Michoacan and we're rivals, or I'm Mexicano and you're like Salvadorian, we're rivals. If you go back far enough, we're all the same people and we're from the US. So that's kind of why we discuss indigenous culture in some of our Chicano studies classes, because if you go back far enough, we're all from the same area, right? Number 5, the appearance of a syncretic culture. That means like synced up, like synchronized swimming. But syncretic culture also means like a lot of different people coming together. Mexico has blacks, whites, Middle Easterners, Asian people, indigenous people, European, and they all come together to make a Mexicano, right? Mestizaje, or cultural mixing. That's why in our class we have brown people, we have light brown people, we have dark brown people, we have like people with like that have like maybe more Asian features. We have people that have maybe more African features, more European features, because we're a huge melting pot in Mexico. Number 6 is very easy to understand. There's intense conflict in the wide spectrum of areas. Like we have, well, recently, like police brutality against Mexicanos, but also like education reform. We're fighting for indigenous rights. We're fighting for like immigrant rights. We're fighting for educational rights. We're fighting for like X, Y, and Z, right? Number 7, um, that's just a very long sentence and confusing, that says a lot of Chicanos have been poor or have had low incomes. Number 8, the prolonged subordination of the community. That means since 1848, when the war ended, Mexicanos and Mexicanos in the US, especially in the Southwest, but all over the US, are seen as like second class citizens since that war. Before the war, we owned massive amounts of land and we were, the kings of our communities and all that. And we were highly accepted because it was Mexico. But once that war happens, like we become automatically the next day after even the war starts, not even before the war ends, but the war starts, we become second class citizens and our rights don't matter anymore. Um, and if you fast forward 150 years, sometimes it seems like it's still that way, right? So especially when you talk about like immigration and all that. So let's see. We have these 8 differentiating factors. I think the first discussion of the week will probably have to do with one of these. I haven't even looked at it yet. Oh, it has to do with the reinterpretation of male dominance. So I think so. Let's see. So next week, let me stop sharing this, and actually we can stop recording.